Hello and welcome to another podcast. Today we are going to look at evaluating heat risks. Heat risks refer to certain variables that human beings can be placed under or placed in that increase the likelihood of heat-related illnesses. There are a lot of heat risks out there, and the goal of today is to provide a better understanding, highlight the goals of what we're looking at in order to mitigate heat risks, and to provide sound advice to people in charge of making sound decisions to prevent personnel getting a heat-related illness. So having a close look at introductions to evaluation of the heat risks, we need to acknowledge that heat-related illnesses don't just pop up. They don't come out of nowhere. They're a spectrum disorder, and with that, they're usually built up from something that is quite minor and easily detectable or predictable, and obviously they can go all the way to the end of being a medical emergency. In regards to how many people are affected by heat worldwide, it's really difficult to put a number on it. A lot of the times when it goes into emergency departments or things like that, it's not put down as a heat-related illness. It's put down as dehydration or exposure or something like that, which means data collection is quite difficult outside of the ADF. Now, there are a few individual companies out there in the US and Japan mostly that are using data, mostly with trade workers, athletes, things like that, in order to identify certain risk factors that are exposing their personnel and therefore reducing productivity and also increasing the amount of work cover that is being applied for. So a lot of data has come out of those particular areas of certain risk factors and trends that have been noted in order to build a better understanding about generating plans in mitigating the overall heat risks to personnel. Now, in organizations, people that are involved in preventative medicines, they are the personnel that play a vital piece in the puzzle of evaluating and advising commanders and people who are coming up with decisions on making sound decisions of mitigating this heat risk. It's the medical personnel that are responsible for the aggressive treatment of heat illness. And because medics and medical personnel are often front line with the workers as part of a risk mitigation for the heat exposure, it's also a good idea for medical personnel to have an understanding of heat-related risks in order to advise commanders on how to implement plans to reduce the amount of casualties that occur. Obviously, prevention is the best goal. Prevention is always better than trying to cure the disorder once it happens. So the whole point of today will be looking at all the things we can do to prevent an illness as opposed to managing the illness itself. So to start off understanding heat risks, it is obviously very important to understand how heat is accumulated in the body and how it is dissipated as well. So heat generation and heat loss is something that comes under thermohomeostasis or thermoregulation in the body. So it's a process in which the body goes under in order to maintain a steady interval of the body temperature, despite any external conditions or variables that come into play. Now, the maintenance of body temperature usually likes to sit within a very tight range of around that 36.5 to 37.5. This temperature allows for enzyme and immune response to be optimal. The mechanisms that we look at for thermoregulation involves effective censoring of the heat, central control, and then a efferent response, usually involving peripheral and central thermoreceptors around the body, in order to decrease and increase body temperature and to detect an increase or decrease in body temperature in order to engage in a physiological response. There are a huge amount of external influences that we'll have a closer look at today, and a lot of these will fall under the same influence as risk factors. Now, when the body detects an increase in body temperature, the body responds by activating sweat glands with the sympathetic nervous system, which increases the amount of heat loss. It also shunts a whole bunch of blood to the skin, causing a huge amount of loss via radiation, and it decreases the release of catecholamines and hormones from the thyroid and adrenal glands in order to reduce metabolic activity. On top of that, we obviously have all of our behavioral changes of reducing our movements, opening up our body positions, reducing intake of food, and removing clothing as well. In the event the body temperature decreases, then we obviously have a slightly different effect. With our skin and our vascular system, we have a huge amount of vasoconstriction of the skin arterioles, and that causes the blood to bypass the skin, leading to a decrease of heat loss from that radiation effect. We also have an increase of catecholamine release and an increase of metabolic rate, which obviously increases our metabolism, generating more heat. We get the small muscles in our body called erector pili that contract in order to cause goosebumps, which is the hairs on our skin sticking up, and that creates an ability to trap heat and trap airflow around us in order to mitigate heat loss further. And we have a primary motor central response directly related to our hypothalamus, which causes our skeletal muscles to contract. That's known as shivering. And then we have our behavioral changes. So the methods in which heat is lost from the skin to the external environment occurs via radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. Heat loss via radiation occurs in the forms of infrared rays and accounts for approximately 60% of all the total body loss. Now, this is obviously environment dependent, which we'll discuss, but that's generally the way it works. So when the body temperature exceeds the surrounding temperature, heat is radiated from the body. If you're in an environment in which the external temperature exceeds the body temperature, radiation doesn't work. Conduction and convection is heat loss via the movement of air. Around 15% is lost via air movement, or direct contact with solid objects generally accounts for about 3% of heat loss. So after heat is conducted into the air, it's carried away by the air current, and as heat loss is lost through solid objects, it obviously just disperses within that solid object. Evaporation is the last one, which is lost through sweat, and is regulated. The amount and rate of sweating accounts for approximately 22% of the total heat loss. Now, even when you are not actively sweating, water is still evaporated from your skin and your lungs at a rate of around about 600 to 700 mils a day. And that also adds to an overall concentration of heat loss and fluid loss as well. Now, this is particularly important when you look at different environments in which the body doesn't sweat as much. So that's how heat is generated, and that is how heat is lost in the body. So we need to understand that naturally our body is involved in generating heat. Our metabolism, our muscle movement, our digestion, our enzyme activity, all these things have a byproduct of heat. And when that occurs, we have to have systems in place that can disperse this heat. Now, radiation, as mentioned, is the most common one. It happens every day that we're in an environment that our core temperature is greater than our atmospheric temperature, and we just permeate heat. When we look at effectiveness of heat and effectiveness of heat in certain environments and certain risk factors, that's where things get complicated. One of the largest variables we have to play with heat management comes down to acclimatization, which we'll spend time later on talking about. And we'll also spend the rest of the lesson looking at certain risk factors that either increase the amount of heat that's being produced or puts us in a state that decreases the possibility of heat being dispersed. It's when we lose this balance between heat production and heat distribution that we actually get our heat illnesses. So if we have a better understanding of the risk factors and we can advise people on those risk factors and how to mitigate them, then we can have a better probability of preventing heat from being a problem. So we'll start with our environmental factors, which is arguably one of the largest ones that we have no direct control over. It doesn't take much to figure out that when you go north in Australia, in the really hot, humid areas, you're going to be more susceptible to heat. The reason for that is mostly got to do with the humidity. Humidity increases the temperature that's felt around the actual body. And if you're in an environment that has 70% plus humidity, you are unable to lose heat via evaporation, via convection without external air, and via radiation. It just doesn't happen. So you're unable to lose heat at all. Touching of cold surfaces is pretty much the only thing that still works. But as noted, that's only 3%. So the risk factors associated with a hot, humid environment obviously increase because the ability to lose heat is greatly diminished. As the humidity drops, the lower we go down the country and south, we have different risk factors. And these risk factors are often overlooked. And it's got to do with the fact that we're now in an environment that is extremely dry. So it can be dry and it can be hot. So what happens in those environments is we tend to lose a lot more water from our skin from not sweating. Okay, so obviously north we're sweating a lot, losing a huge amount of fluid and electrolytes. But when we're down in the dry areas, we lose heat and we lose water subtly. So we end up slowly dehydrating ourselves. It's almost like a slow smoking of a meat or putting something in a dehydrator. It slowly sucks the fluid out of someone, which means that when you engage in high activity, you're generally more dehydrated without knowing that you're dehydrated. People will always know they're dehydrated and sweating a lot in a high humidity area, but as you start moving down into the drier areas, the subtlety of dehydration takes longer to kick in, so the acclimatization towards dehydration occurs within your body until you engage in high activity, which puts you at greater risk because you have less fluid in your body to disperse that heat. When we move down really south and you have the cold nights, those sort of things, there's that temperature regulation that can often put somebody at risk because of that accumulative dehydration factor as well. Okay, so there's the climate zones and the risks associated with environmental factors that we'll need to consider depending where we're working. Other risk factors obviously involve the type of activity that we're doing. So the high risks activity associated with heat are the ones that involve large muscles and a lot of muscles in order to do that activity. So if you are doing weight-bearing activity and you're using a large amount of muscle mass in your legs, in your back, across your chest, then you're obviously going to generate a large amount of heat. Now, if you are doing activity that is high intensity, so very minimal breaks, high heart rate, asking a lot of the VO2 and your cardiovascular system, that's also going to generate a lot of heat. So this taps into an area known as your total metabolic rate. And as you contract a muscle, you are obviously dispersing a huge amount of heat. 60% of all ATP use is involved just in heat production. And if you increase the amount of ATP use, you're obviously going to generate a larger amount of heat that your body has to deal with. So the larger the muscle mass, the more engagement of fibers you need in an activity, the more heat you are going to generate. And that's not even talking about the variables that is humans yet. That is just talking about the activities and how long you do it. If you're doing low level activity, okay, which generally is associated with walking, it doesn't seem like a high impact or high energy activity, but you do it for an incredibly long duration and you do it with weight bearing. Initially, it may seem quite easy, quite low impact, but the cumulative effect of constant muscle contracted under load and the inability to lose heat can accumulate and therefore cause a problem 5, 6, 7 Ks down the track. Okay, so just take that into account, that it's often a variable associated with the type of activity and the duration that plays a toll on heat generation. And if you don't have things in place in order to encourage heat loss, then these factors increase. Now this obviously links to the type of clothes that are being worn when doing these activities or being in these environments. To allow for effective cooling, especially when increased generation has occurred, we need to engage in air movement. We have to encourage convection to be a bigger lead in heat loss, especially if we're in an environment that doesn't really lend itself to lots of evaporation, so radiation. Hot environments, not much radiation, so we're going to have to encourage convection, and that's done through air movement. So if you're wearing clothes that prevent air movement or airflow around the skin, then you're obviously going to stop the ability for heat to be lost via that way, which means the person is going to need to sweat more to encourage evaporation. Evaporation through clothes is not very effective. And often what happens is when your clothes are soaked with sweat, is the water that is bound to the fibers of your clothes will increase in temperature from your body, and then it will sit in your clothes. It will pretty much work as a layer to prevent further heat loss, which of course will encourage you to sweat more, and then it's just a compounding effect. So certain items of clothing, things that are very close to your skin, thermals, any really protective gear like firefighting equipment or hazmat suits, things like that, and obviously wearing body armor, these things add to the inability to disperse heat and obviously mean that convection and radiation isn't possible, which encourages the body to think that evaporation is the only option. And then we move to the most diverse variables that we have, which is obviously the variables that is human, the things that are hard to predict and hard to measure as well. So just going through these as a list, if someone has an underlying illness, that generally means that they may have a fever or they may be susceptible to having a fever, but it also means their body is fighting that infection. And if we don't have the body within that optimal range, then they're more susceptible to be affected by that illness as well. If it involves the gastrointestinal or upper respiratory tract, then obviously it plays a role in our metabolic rate, and generally more susceptible to heat regardless of whatever the illness is. When we look at nutrition, electrolytes and dehydration, they generally play a role together. Having a balanced diet is relatively okay, normally speaking. When you go to an environment that you're not acclimatized to and you start sweating a lot, that sweat generally contains a huge amount of salt, which means you need to compensate for that by increasing your salt intake in those environments. But because it's super hot, your appetite decreases by virtue of your metabolic rate needing to reduce. So you don't want to eat as much, and you certainly don't want to eat salt because you're already thirsty, and salt just drives that thirst a little bit further. So it's a hard recipe to say, yeah, you need to eat salt when you 100% don't want to. The reason salt is very important in the body is it's one of those electrolytes. Actually, it is the electrolyte or the cation that has the highest osmotic draw within the vascular space. And what that means is as the fluid is pushed out of the capillary beds by normal hydrostatic pressure, it's the salt or the sodium that draws the fluid back into the vascular space in order to reduce dehydration and to maintain that vascular volume a little bit more effectively. Now, if you were to drink a whole bunch of water and not have adequate salt intake, they say that your body will only retain about 80% of the water that's consumed. Okay, so it's a little bit less effective in doing that. Obviously, the more salt you lose, the worse this gets off. And you couple this with dehydration, and the body starts to lose its effectiveness. Now, if you lose up to about 2% of your body water, you can still be relatively effective. Okay, so there's no adverse effects. And it's generally around that 2% mark that you start to feel thirsty. So generally speaking, whilst you're doing activity, if you drink to thirst, that's a relatively good way to look at it, especially when you're busy and you've got things to do. However, that's not really effective at getting your body hydration back up. And sculling a whole bunch of water in one sitting is very ineffective because of that hydrostatic pressure that we spoke about. If you get a bolus dose of fluid, it's obviously going to increase hydrostatic pressure, push into the interstitial space. If you don't have the salt in your body, you're not going to bring it back in order to make it effective. Okay, so that's one of those things. A lot of the times you just end up urinating a lot more, and it can be a false sense of hydration because that bolus of fluid can generally come out well diluted in the urine, giving the appearance of, hydrated. So it's a good advice to have people post-activity during the night consuming those 1.5 liters of fluid slowly with food in order to properly hydrate the body. Now, this need is increased if you're ever working at altitude as well. When we look at physical fitness, it's well publicized and well understood that someone's cardiovascular fitness plays a large role in acclimatization. Generally speaking, people with a higher level of aerobic fitness are better tolerant of exercising and working in the heat. So if you're with a demographic that isn't as fit, then they're going to be more susceptible to heat. And having people train cardiovascular fitness and not just the fitness that they enjoy can also be a good idea, especially in the hot environments. And that couples obviously with body mass. Okay, now when we talk about body mass versus fat, it's no lie that body fat is a great insulator of heat. So people that have larger amounts of adipose tissue over their body, they are very susceptible at retaining heat. Now, if you couple that with somebody who has a large body mass, so a huge amount of muscle mass, with a layer of fat over the top, then not only do you have a person that is perfect at generating heat, but you also have someone who is great at retaining heat. So it's probably a worse recipe. Now, these people are generally large, strong men. And just to let that sink in, so any large, strong men that aren't ripped athletes, those sort of things, are generally going to be pretty tolerant with heat, but then once heat gets to a point of generation versus dispersion, they're going to be very ineffective at losing that heat themselves and will often need help in reducing their body temperature. Taking diuretics like coffee, alcohol, caffeine drinks, or obviously medication of diuretics is obviously going to be a huge variable that decreases the ability to compensate for heat because of that dehydration factor. Certain medications like your pseudoephedrine, antidepressants, things like beta blockers, can also have a huge effect on body regulation of temperature, because it either causes vasoconstriction, causes increased metabolic rate. So if you have people that are engaging in high activity in hot environments that are on these medications, it's just a variable to look out for, that they may need that little bit of extra help in order to lose the heat. And the last one is the motivation and drive of individuals. Things that we love about certain workers can often be the detriment of those individuals. So people that push themselves or have a can-do attitude or have a drive to get things done can often be amazing and resilient and really strong attributes that we look for, but at the same time can often be at the person's detriment when in these environments, because they will regularly push beyond the point of comfort, regularly push beyond the point of personal interest, sacrifice themselves, if you will, in order to achieve the goal. So it's these strong, highly motivated, resilient individuals that often need just an eye to be kept on, and often the encouragement that they need to stop. They need to stop and allow their body to cool. They need to work within the regulations that have been provided for them in order to maintain that optimal performance. Is usually the best way to sell it to these individuals, is if you rest now, you'll be more effective later. If you collapse and we lose you, then it's obviously going to be a massive detriment to the team. Those sort of incentives generally get through to these particular individuals that are highly sought after. Linking personnel with activities with environment, we get a recipe that is known as acclimatization. Acclimatization is best defined as the programming or training of a body to work more effectively in heat. So acclimatization to heat begins with the initial exposure of an environment. And generally speaking, about 50% of personnel will be acclimatized within the first week. Now, there are a huge amount of variables that generally play a role in someone's acclimatization, which means when you're working with a team, you'll have people at different stages of acclimatization with no real way of denoting who's acclimatized and who's not. So you pretty much have to look after the whole group as a group for the duration of the acclimatization period, which generally takes about 14 days, 2 weeks. Now, the goal of acclimatization is not to stop the person sweating. Sweating's a great thing. Sweating's a very effective way to lose heat, especially in the ways that people like to work. Hot environments, protective clothes, means evaporation is pretty much all they've got. The bad thing about evaporation and using sweat to disperse heat is obviously the amount of salt that the person loses, because when you lose a bunch of salt, you lose the ability to really hydrate yourself effectively. So it's a compounding effect. So when you are acclimatized, you will sweat, but your sweat will contain around 60% less sodium and electrolytes within it in order to maintain that in the body, which means you don't need an increase in salt intake. You don't have to do the things you hate doing in hot environments like eating salty foods. You can just maintain a normal diet, normal water intake, and really regulate your body's temperature via fluid intake and cooling down. Generally speaking, a program for acclimatization has you doing exercise for at least 100 minutes for at least 3 times a week in that environment. Now, it's best to do 100 minutes flat. There's 100 minutes of activities that you're going to be doing in those environments, if it's building, if it's digging, whatever it is, in order to get acclimatized. If you can't meet that 100 minutes, then 2 50-minute sessions is obviously okay. People going to cold environments, being exposed to air conditioning, doesn't ruin the acclimatization, but it certainly stops it. So sometimes having people in an environment resting can increase the amount of acclimatization or decrease the amount of time that it takes for someone to acclimatize. People who are used to acclimatizing will generally acclimatize faster. So if somebody lives in an environment like Darwin and goes away on leave, doesn't do any activity for a bunch of weeks because they're just relaxing, then comes back, a quick 4-5 day cycle of acclimatization, basically just training in the environment, can bring that person back into a position. Now, when we look at the demographics of who can acclimatize better, we have a few variables that make it more difficult for people to acclimatize. Generally speaking, males are more effective at acclimatizing and working in heat than females. That's generally speaking. Ethnic groups that are biologically designed to be in warmer environments, okay, tall, slender people, basically, they're more likely to acclimatize earlier. People who are generally fit, so have a higher VO2 max, is the actual variable, will acclimatize better. So there are programs out there that link your run time, 2K run time, with acclimatization programs, because generally if you can run at a certain speed, you have a certain VO2 max, which means you'll have the ability to acclimatize faster. People with higher BMIs and higher fat concentrations around their body generally will have a lower VO2 max, therefore affect acclimatization, and also, as we spoke about, the distribution of muscle versus fat obviously makes you more susceptible to heat. Okay, so a lot of the time when people come into a new environment for an acclimatization program, they don't often get the time period, because it generally means that if you're working for 3 months in an environment, you need 2 weeks beforehand in order to acclimatize before doing that work. So a smart way to do it is to do the 3 months worth of work, but then have a program within that work that slowly builds up the intensity of the work that is being done in order to allow for acclimatization to occur at the start before the bulk of the work is done in the middle. And that way you can mitigate the amount of heat you'll have and therefore casualties that you'll likely see. Now, in order to assist all this balancing of risk factors, we obviously have to understand the personnel, and you have to understand the activities and the clothes and everything that they're working in. But as far as environmental risk factors go, we have a way to measure what's known as the wet bulb globe temperature. And that is a temperature that is taken from a series of measurements. So the measurements involve 3 main temperatures that are calculated together. The first temperature is a combination of both humidity and airflow. So because heat loss through evaporation and perspiration is the body's most important method of cooling, especially in these environments, this particular temperature has a 70% weighting on the overall temperature. Okay, so 70% of this particular number is taken into account compared to the other 2. The second temperature looks at the radiant heat. So radiant heat is generally associated with solar energy and that load on the body. Radiant heat is independent of air motion and all these other things, so it's taken as a variable in order to take into account how much external heat and how ineffective, say things like radiation from your body, is going to be. So that value accounts for 20% of the total number. And the last one looks at that ambient temperature. Okay, so the actual air temperature as it's measured in the shade. Okay, so that's basically what that last one is, and that's generally the one you get when you look up the temperature on your app, is the ambient temperature. Because that has the least impact on the human body and the least impact associated with heat loss or heat gain, it accounts for 10%. So when you add all these temperatures together, you get the WBGT temperature. That is a temperature designed to take in certain variables that affect heat in the body, in environments that we're working, in order to give us an understanding of how effective people are going to be at losing heat and how likely they're going to be at generating heat doing certain activity. From there, we have tables that we work with. Now, these tables are designed to work with people that are fit, okay, so have that good VO2 max. They are already acclimatized, so they're fully acclimatized to the environment, they're hydrated, they're fed, and they're rested. If, for some reason, these particular things or assumptions aren't actually true or could not be true, then we need to monitor the individuals because it means they're not optimal for these particular tables. That's all it means. We still use them, but it means they're not optimal for this particular table, so we monitor for signs of heat. That's all we do. So looking at the different tables, we have options. We have a work-rest table that is designed for an hourly cycle in which you work and you rest, depending on what you're wearing, the temperature that you read, and what sort of intensity of work you are doing. Nice and simple. These work-rest tables are designed to do 5 cycles. So 5 hours of working and resting in these environments is what you do, and then you have what's known as a recovery period. When you do short intervals of work with times of rest, what is actually encouraged is the body will naturally get warmer, generate more heat, get to the point that it starts to be a little bit less effective at losing heat, and then you'll rest, increasing the amount of heat that can be lost in order to bring yourself back down to a starting point of safety before you start again. And then you'll keep doing this for 5 cycles, 5 hours, and then you'll rest. And obviously the work-rest ratio varies associated with what temperature you get. So generally speaking, the temperature is measured every hour, and then you work to that measurement for the next hour. Okay, that's basically the way it works. Now, when you see the CM written on there, that stands for critical management. Now, you are allowed to work in critical management, but it generally means that somebody has accepted that higher level of risk. Okay, because basically what it means is any temperature you generate is going to be very difficult to lose in that environment without external factors coming in. Now that can be iced water, that can be electrolyte drinks, that can be fanned, air-conditioned areas. All those sort of things can obviously do it, but you cannot effectively lose heat in that environment, in those clothes, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's what critical management works, and you shouldn't do any activity in that environment unless you have the permission of the boss that they've accepted that risk. That generally means you need healthcare workers on site, and basically speaking, you're going to get about a 5% of the workforce that are going to become heat casualties, and that's what is accepted. If all those things aren't accepted or put in place, then you really shouldn't be doing work in those environments because the risk is too high. Okay, so that's what CM means, and that's what the work table is. The other option you have when you are engaging your work, let's say you have an activity that you don't really want to break up over the work rest period, you just want to get it done, you can use what's known as the continuous work cycle. The continuous work cycle is designed to be done once and then have a recovery period, and really only done twice in a 24-hour period. Okay, so we don't want to get into the habit of doing continuous work, then recovery time, then continuous work, recovery time, back to back to back. Okay, so you only get 2 continuous works within a 24-hour period, and then you've got to go back to the work-rest ratio. The reason is the longer you work at that intensity, in that environment, with those clothes on, the more heat you're going to generate, and the closer to that threshold of heat-affected illness you are going to get. The higher you get to that number or that risk level, the longer it's going to take to cool back down, and often put you at greater risk the second time you do it or the third time you do it. The more times you work at that intensity for that duration and all those other things we spoke about, increases your risk of having a heat-affected illness. So we don't want to do it. The cumulative effect of heat is obviously well quantified to the point that if someone has had a heat-affected illness, they generally get removed from that environment for a period of time, denoted generally by a health center, before coming back into that environment. Okay, so that's generally the way we work. So if you want to do a continuous one because you want that time period in order to get a job done, you can, but it comes with a bigger risk. Now, regardless of which one you chose, whether it's the work-rest ratio for 5 cycles or a continuous work, you do the associated recovery period in which somebody is put into an environment and you encourage heat loss. Okay, so you take off all the variables that you're working with in order to really encourage that person to lose the heat. So to provide an example, if you're working, let's just say we're magically working in an area where things are consistent. Okay, so you're consistently wearing body armor, you're consistently doing moderate work, and it's 29 degrees is what the WBGT says. Now, it's not going to happen, but just for the point of this, that's what we're going to say. If you're using the work-rest table, you do 20 minutes of work generating that heat, and then you have 40 minutes of rest where you're bringing that heat back down. And you do that 5 times for 5 hours, and then you need to recover, no work, for 60 minutes. And then you do it again, recover, and then you do it again and again and again. Obviously that temperature is not going to maintain, but you can keep doing that safely for a period of time. Obviously, if you don't have any rest, then you remove that variable in which the work-rest table was designed, which means rested, okay, and risks increase. But that's generally the way the work-rest table works. If we do continuous work in that environment at that rate with that clothing, you can do 70 minutes of work and then you need 60 minutes of work rest. And then you do 7 minutes work and you need 60 minutes of rest. And then that's it. No more continuous work for the 24 hours. You go back to the work-rest table after the recovery of the 60 minutes. Okay, so that's how we use the work-rest ratio. But whilst we're doing that, we are also looking at the other variables that aren't being taken into account. Moderate work for someone can be heavy work for someone else and light work for other people. We have the demographics that are different. We have the body compositions that's different. And to assume that everybody is fit, acclimatized, hydrated, fed, and rested at all times is a pretty poor assumption to make. So it's up to commanders or people in charge of the site and healthcare providers in order to advise and monitor and educate individuals on how to understand heat variables and what sort of things can occur in order to encourage heat loss and mitigate the risk overall of generating heat-related illnesses. But until next time, take care.